You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios.
It's clear to see that English colonizers in the aftermath of King Philip's War are turning from evangelizing to enslaving and exterminating. But later generations of Anglo-Americans return to evangelizing. And I think it's important to see both forms of othering coexisting and to see the violence in each, one aimed at the destruction of lives and the other at the destruction of cultures.
Hello, and welcome to episode 392 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. History tells us who we are and how we came to be who we are as people, cultures, and nations. So what does history have to tell us about how we, as Americans, came to define people by their race? The visual ways we have grouped people together based on their skin color, facial features, hair texture, and ancestry. As you might imagine, history has a lot to tell us about this question. So today, we're going to explore one aspect of the answer to this question by focusing on some of the ways that religion shaped European and early American ideas about race and racial groupings. Catherine Jin Lum is an associate professor of religious studies at Stanford University. She's also the author of the book Heathen: Religion and Race in American History. Using details from her book Heathen, Catherine reveals information about the religious landscape in Europe between the 15th and 19th centuries, so the 1400s to the early 1800s, the ways Europeans and later Americans used Christian religions as a justification for colonizing the Americas and the peoples who lived there, and details about how Europeans and later Americans used religion and ideas about the concept of the heathen to define and form categories of race and their national identities. But first, the Innovation Studios team and I are working on some really exciting episodes for this fall. Episodes that explore what political culture in the early American Republic looked like, an investigation of Carpenter's Hall and the First Continental Congress, and our 10-year anniversary episode in early October. So be sure you're following Ben Franklin's World in your favorite podcast app so that you don't miss any of these exciting historical adventures. To follow Ben Franklin's World, open up your favorite podcast app, search for Ben Franklin's World, and then hit the follow or subscribe button. Okay, are you ready to explore religion, heathens, and race in early America? Let's go meet our expert guide. Joining us is an associate professor of religious studies at Stanford University. She's the author of numerous articles and books, including Damned Nation: How in America from the Revolution to Reconstruction, and her most recent book, Heathen: Religion and Race in American History. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Catherine Jin Lum.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really delighted to be here.
And we're really excited to have you. So in your book, Heathen: Religion and Race-Making in American History, you explore the complicated and evolving relationship between race-making and religion from even before 1492 to the present day. So before we dive into the topics of religion and race-making, would you help us understand what options Europeans had for religions to worship or participate in during the early modern period, which we would classify as the 15th and 16th centuries?
So let me just preface this by saying that I am not a historian of religion in early modern Europe. So I'm going to be speaking extremely generally here. But in Eastern Europe, Eastern Orthodoxy prevailed until the fall of Constantinople in 1453 to the Ottoman Empire. In Western Europe in the 15th century, most people were Catholics, though there were also communities of Jews and Muslims. Jews were expelled from England in 1290, which is an act that scholar Geraldine Hung says was actually constitutive of English identity as not Jewish. And she names that as kind of a biopolitical act of racial state formation. The close of the 15th century saw Columbus's voyage to Hispaniola, which coincided with the culmination of the Reconquista and the expulsion or the forced conversions of Jews and Muslims from Spain. And that had really important consequences also for how the Spanish treated indigenous and African descended populations in the Americas. But I think we'll probably get to that later. With the advent of the Reformation, Europe experienced profound religious upheaval. So many varieties of Protestantism splintered an already tenuous Catholic consensus, and also challenged state governance to the extent that it was bound up with the authority of Rome. At the same time, I think it's important to note that, there were also people who were practicing popular folk religions at this time, as a number of scholars have shown. They had interests in occult and magic, and they brought these interests to the Americas. So again, that's super broad, overly generalized landscape.
Yeah, but it's still a good landscape. And it's interesting to me that the English were defining themselves as not Jewish by 1290 because historian Linda Colley wrote this book called Britons. And in this book, she makes the case that in the 18th and early 19th centuries, Britons identified themselves by being not Catholic. They were Protestants. Protestantism and having a pro-Protestant identity was key to being British. And we just know that the English weren't the only nationalities to define themselves by a religion they were not. As you just mentioned, there was a sizable group in Spain during the Reconquista who began to define themselves as Catholic and not Muslims or Jews.
Yes, exactly. Again, I didn't really get into the Spanish expulsion and forced conversion of Jews and Muslims, but also this Spanish notion of purity of blood, limpieza de sangre, right? The notion that people who had Jews or Muslims in their genealogical lines did not have purity of blood. These suspicions then also followed people of African descent, and there were a lot of discussions about this around indigenous people.
So I think we have a sense now that people in early modern Europe were very religious, regardless of the religion that they worshipped. But as you point out in your book, Heathen, there were also heathens. Catherine, what did early modern Europeans mean by the term heathen? How did they understand the word heathen?
The term heathen is roughly an Anglo-Germanic translation of the Latin pagan, which itself overlapped with the Greek figure of the barbarian. So for the ancient Greeks, barbarians were understood to be humans, but sort of barely, right? They were foreigners who did not speak Greek. They were supposed to lack law and order, to live outside of cities and uncultivated areas. Pagans were similarly understood to be people who lived in the countryside, so rural, rustic people who continued to worship the old Roman gods and who did not accept Christianity. So as Christianity spreads northward, heathens are then also understood to be people who are wandering in the wildernesses. So the root of the word heathen is heath, right? People wandering in the heath, and the heathens were people who basically clung or who were supposed to cling to their old tribal gods like Thor and like Odin instead of accepting the new religion of Christianity. As Europeans began to learn more about the fact that there was more of the world out there, the categories of heathen and pagan also filtered their view of people in other places. So travel literature, maps of the world sometimes questioned whether they were even people at all, right? Or whether they were fantastical creatures who are part human and part monstrous on the outskirts of the known world. But when travel literature did accept that people were humans in other parts of the world, it paints them either as humans who were to be pitied for their ignorant heathenism, because they had never had a chance to know what Europeans believed to be the one true God, or as humans to be shuddered at because of their demonic practices. Either way, heathens were understood to be deluded and, for the most part, damned.
Even in your answer, we covered several different European populations who early modern Europeans would have viewed as heathens. Vikings who worshipped old gods like Thor and Odin. We can picture the Celtic peoples, the Angles and the Saxons in what would become England and the United Kingdom. And all of these populations worshipped old gods and often lived outside of cities. But was this idea of heathens, people who worshipped old gods and who tended to live outside of cities and rejected or maybe just never had access to Christianity, was this idea of who a heathen was a universal understanding of who early modern Europeans meant when they said the word heathen or described a heathen? Was this their understanding in 1492 on the eve of the European colonial age?
So my book looks at the development of this notion of a heathen world out there around ideas about heathen landscapes and ideas about heathen bodies. And these ideas actually traced back to biblical texts, according to those who are putting them forth. But these biblical texts, the people who are deploying them argue that what was written about the quote unquote heathen in biblical times is equally applicable to the heathen in whatever times they're writing in. So the idea of heathen landscapes is that those lands are barren. They are wildernesses. This comes from the book of Isaiah, the idea that unbelievers, their lands become desolate, overgrown with thorns and brambles, etc. And it requires the renovation, essentially, of wrong belief to make these lands blossom as the rose. In terms of heathen bodies, missionaries often point to the first chapter of the book of Romans to argue that heathens have basically corrupted their bodies because they don't worship the one true God. They worship the creation instead of the creator. And so they have become like the things they worship, creeping, crawling, participating in acts of sexual immorality, etc. And so again, all of this traces back to the scripture and is applied to people who are understood to be heathens over time.
Let us move now from Europe to the Americas. So in 1492, after 1492, the Spanish began to establish colonies in North and South America and the Caribbean. And the Spanish set up what would be a model for other European nations like France, the Dutch Republic, and England to follow throughout the early modern period. So my question is, Catherine, how did European perceptions of heathens shape early European encounters with indigenous peoples that they would meet in the Americas and the Caribbean? And perhaps you could tell us about Thomas Harriot and John White, who were the first Englishmen to visit North America. They visited the Roanoke colony in 1585, and then they wrote a book about their experiences, a book that included Thomas Harriot's words and John White's drawings of the plants, animals, and indigenous peoples they encountered while they explored the lands of Senecomica, which is an area that was, and still is, inhabited by Powhatan peoples along the Tidewater region of Virginia.
Again, the assumptions that Europeans are bringing with them, assumptions that heathens don't know how to take care of the land and that they don't know how to take care of their bodies, influence how they see indigenous people. And it means that largely they fail to see and to appreciate how indigenous people live on and with the land and to understand their kinship and social systems. Of course, European views of indigenous people differ depending on where they go. So the French in Canada and Columbus in the Circumcaribbean tend to see indigenous people as existing in a state of nature and lacking rulers, laws, and religion. But the Spanish, who come to the powerful empires of Mexico and Peru, see the practices and beliefs of the Aztecs and the Incas as dangerously demonic inversions of Christian society. In some areas, there's also a change over time in how European people see indigenous people kind of through this lens of heathenness. In Virginia, for instance, Thomas White and John Harriot initially are very, very ethnographic almost in the way that they are looking at indigenous people, illustrating what they understand of indigenous society, sending back very detailed reports. And then, over time, as colonists engage in increasing acts of violence against indigenous people and, as they're encroaching on the lands of indigenous people, their attitude towards indigenous people changes. So instead of this kind of careful attention to what indigenous societies look like, there is now these blanket statements about indigenous people as heathens, as essentially Canaanites who deserve what they receive at the hands of the colonists.
And to go back to the writings of Thomas Harriot and others who wrote these accounts of what the Americas and indigenous peoples look like, you can see how their perceptions of heathen colored their descriptions. So White and Harriot land in a space that they see as untamed wilderness, right? A place that they viewed as uninhabited, undeveloped, even as they encounter indigenous peoples like the Powhatan everywhere they go. But they then classify these indigenous peoples as heathens because they're clearly not Christians. And these descriptions and depictions that are colored by the idea of heathens and what it meant to be a heathen are the works that circulate around Europe and are used by Europeans to try and make sense of the Americas and their peoples. So it's like Europeans are automatically starting with a bias towards how to look at the Americas and the peoples who live there.
Right. It's interesting, in Harriot and White's report, they recognize that indigenous people have religious leaders. They have what appears to be religious organizations, or they have what appears to be what Europeans would call quote unquote religion. But White and Harriot in their report also include, we were talking about Europeans who were labeled as heathens. They also include images of the Angles and Saxons back in their heathen days, right? That these are people who were tattooed all over, who were, very violent. They've got pictures of people not wearing clothes, holding the heads of the people that they've killed. And the implication there is that, look, if we used to be like this, Christianity turned us into what we are now. Christianity can do the same for these heathens that we're encountering. So that's also an interesting approach that they take.
As these European explorers tried to make sense of the new world around them and the new to them indigenous peoples they encountered, how did their view of the heathen and the Bible explain how indigenous peoples came to the Americas? Did they think that indigenous peoples came from Europe or Africa through migration, or did they somehow think that they manifested on the land?
Yeah, I mean, the presence of indigenous people in the Americas requires a lot of explanation for Europeans because it's not obviously clear in the scriptures where they came from or how they fit into biblical history. I think it's important to remember that Europeans at this time are really reading the Bible as a true and basically literal account of human history. So as they are learning more about other people in the world, they're trying to cram their histories into biblical chronologies. One popular origin story about indigenous people in the Americas was that they were descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. Another pretty influential theory came from the Spanish Jesuit José de Acosta, who claimed that indigenous Americans were basically already originally heathens in the so-called Old World, and that they had crossed a land bridge to the Americas where they continued to wander away from the influences of Christianity. According to Acosta, once they crossed this land bridge into the Americas, the devil had free reign with them there because the devil had once had a bit of a toehold in Europe, but had been basically kicked out of Europe and had gone to the remote corners of the world, so that it was in the Americas that the devil was able to corrupt whatever glimmers of truth these wanderers had once had, and basically turned all of their rituals into demonic inversions of Christianity.
There are a lot of writings and oral histories dedicated to the first encounters between indigenous peoples and Europeans. And there also is a large body of literature dedicated to explaining why Europeans decided to establish colonies in the Americas and the Caribbean. And my read on that literature is that there are two primary causes for why Europeans established colonies throughout the Atlantic world. Firstly, the prevailing economic theory of the early modern period was mercantilism. The idea that there is only a finite amount of wealth in the world and that countries needed to keep as much wealth as possible within their country and bring in and generate as much wealth as possible for their country. And then, of course, the second big reason for colonization was religion. Catherine, would you tell us more about the religious reasons that drove Europeans to establish colonies? And I'm also curious, why do we tend to talk about religion and colonization as going hand in hand when we talk about Spanish and French colonial contexts, but we don't tend to talk about religion and colonization as going hand in hand within the English and Dutch contexts?
I like how you laid out the two reasons for the colonization of the Americas. And I guess what I would say to that is that these reasons actually go hand in hand, that people who are primarily interested in evangelization and religious motivations are not disinterested in commercial reasons as well. And people who are primarily interested in commercial reasons also have religious motivations in mind. In terms of the religious rationale for the colonization of the Americas, I think the doctrine of discovery is really significant to note here. And that's the papal bull that divided the quote unquote undiscovered world between Spain and Portugal. And it stipulated that a major justification for colonization was to Christianize the people living in those lands. So basically, the supposed heathenness of indigenous people was used as an excuse to colonize them. And what colonization really meant was putting them to work. So if heathens were understood to be wanderers who did nothing to the land, then missionaries attempted to unheathenize them. In the Spanish context, by quote unquote, reducing them to settlements where they were expected to learn not just Christian doctrines, but also Christian ways of working on the land and making it profitable. In the English context, as you note, there aren't these large-scale reducciones, but the English do establish praying towns where they are trying to create these indigenous settlements that model the settlements that they themselves live in and to change the ways that indigenous people are living on the land.
Now, once Europeans felt that they had wrapped their minds around indigenous peoples in the Americas and instituted different programs to convert them to Christianity, how did these ideas help to create the systems of racialized slavery that were so prevalent throughout the Americas? And for context, I am thinking a lot about historian Edmund Morgan's famous book, American Slavery, American Freedom, because in this book, Morgan studied the development of racialized slavery within the context of English Virginia. And he makes this case that the idea for racialized slavery really developed during Bacon's Rebellion between 1676 and 1677. Morgan argued that poor whites were really unhappy with their lot in colonial Virginia, so a strategy to both curb and excite their rebellion was to unite them against indigenous and African American enslaved peoples, because doing so allowed English society to elevate poor whites above those other peoples, which made poor whites feel better because it served to show them that they weren't actually on the lowest rung of English colonial society, that there were other people beneath them. And I really just simplified Morgan's argument, but that's the basic premise of his book. So, Catherine, what role did religion play in the establishment of racialized slavery within the colonial societies of the Americas? Morgan's argument leans heavily into the economic and labor side of the invention of racialized slavery. So now I'm curious about what role religion played in the creation of racialized slavery.
So Catholic justifications for slavery drew from Aristotle's ideas about quote unquote natural slaves. These are humans who were supposed to be naturally inferior and who supposedly needed guidance from superior humans. So European Catholics are defining as natural slaves those people who need to be Christianized, specifically heathens and Muslims. Muslims also allowed for the enslavement of non-Muslims or infidels. And in practice for both Catholics and Muslims, this most frequently comes to mean Africans. So the Spanish also come to see people of African descent as especially suspect because some of them had converted to Islam. So as we were talking earlier about limpieza de sangre, or the idea of purity of blood, they see enslaved Africans as unable to claim limpieza de sangre because they might have Muslims in their genealogical lines. By contrast, indigenous people who are living in the Americas, there's questions that arise about their blood purity, their limpieza de sangre. In effect, their heathen ignorance shields them from suspicion of crypto-Judaism or crypto-Islam. But then that raises a question about whether they can also be considered quote-unquote natural slaves. So the Spanish debate this, with some of them advocating for, like Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda, and others against, like Bartolomé de las Casas. But in practice, like I said, the indigenous Americans were forced into labor on the land, whether they were officially enslaved or not. In the British context, you see similar religious justifications for enslavement. And there's a couple scholars who've written about this. Catherine Gerbner's Christian Slavery and Rebecca Getz's The Baptism of Early Virginia are both, I think, really important texts that look at the significance of religious justifications for enslavement and the ways in which a notion of hereditary heathenism, the idea that these are people who cannot easily be converted, if they can be converted at all, how that becomes a justification for enslavement.
In your book, Heathen, you discuss how the English crafted an identity in which they viewed themselves as uniquely superior and exceptional to all other European and indigenous peoples. And you mentioned that a big catalyst for this view proved to be the Spanish colonization and Spanish treatment of indigenous peoples. So would you tell us about the Black legend that emerged from England and what prompted English people to define themselves by their non-Spanishness?
The Black legend traces back in large part to Bartolomé de las Casas' 1542, the destruction of the Indies, and in particular from the images that accompanied the translated editions of the destruction of the Indies, which were done by the Protestant engraver Theodore de Bry. So Las Casas was a Dominican friar who came to Hispaniola in 1502 and who participated in the conquest of Cuba in 1513. Las Casas himself had been a landowner and an enslaver on Hispaniola, but it was really his experience of the atrocities against indigenous people during the conquest of Cuba that led him to change his mind about the justness of the conquest. So de Bry's illustrations of Las Casas' text were very graphic and violent. And they basically turned this volume, which was written in the context of these internal Spanish debates over the enslavement of indigenous people, into a Protestant polemic. And in Las Casas, actually, even as he is arguing against the enslavement of indigenous people, argues for the enslavement of people of African descent instead. So the English seize on Las Casas' descriptions and on de Bry's pictures to claim that they're going to be better colonizers and evangelizers. This becomes a useful myth for the English because it provides them with a foil that they can define themselves against.
And what was the reality of this English ambition? Did Protestantism make the English kinder and more gentle in their treatment of indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans?
Quite simply, the answer is no. I think comparing the English and Spanish colonizing projects, and the French too, is really interesting. But I think it also tells us as much about myth making and about memory as it does about what actually happened. I think that the idea that English Protestantism allowed for kinder and gentler treatment of indigenous people and enslaved Africans, again, stems from the Black legend and the idea that the Spanish were so cruel that whatever the English did must pale in comparison. And I think really what it comes down to is that the English were good at rationalizing their violence against indigenous people. So when their meager efforts at missionizing fail and when Native people resist the ongoing encroachments of the English on their lands and lives, the English retaliate with extreme brutality, but they excuse it because in their view, Native people deserve it, just as the unbelieving Canaanites in the Bible deserved holy violence from the Israelites. Right? So the English, particularly in New England, are identifying as God's new chosen people, God's new Israelites. And so as they do that identification, they paint indigenous people as the people who are exterminated in the Bible. But I think it's important to look at arguments like that offered by Jorge Cañizares Scerra in Puritan Conquistadors. The title of that, Puritan Conquistadors, the English were fundamentally not that different from the Spanish. I mean, I think the main differences lie in the ways that English and Spanish societies incorporated or excluded indigenous people, where the English create a society that is much more exclusive of indigenous people, whereas the Spanish create what some scholars call a frontier of inclusion, intermarrying, creating a complicated hierarchical caste system that doesn't make one gentler than the other necessarily. These are different experiences that are violent in their own ways.
So in her book, Heathen, Catherine takes us from just before 1492 into the present day. And she shows us how Europeans and Americans have understood and used the idea of heathens to define their beliefs, courses of actions, and their societies. Catherine, let's move into the 17th century, the 1600s. We've talked some about how Europeans and colonists used religion and the idea of heathens to define the indigenous peoples they encountered and how they treated African and African Americans that they enslaved. But how did Europeans, mainly the English, use religion to help them view the Americas as the perfect setting for new religious-based and religious-focused colonies? Colonies like those that developed in New England.
Yeah. Maybe I can just sketch, again, very, very generally, the religious climate of 17th century England. It was tense for dissenters. So the Church of England was the official established church. It was led by bishops who sat in the House of Lords. And so in terms of the groups that we tend to think of as those who are settling for religious reasons, there are the separatists or the pilgrims and the Puritans who are not separatists. So the pilgrims believe that the Church of England is not sufficiently reformed. So they want to separate from it, hence the term separatists. They're persecuted for doing so. So actually, before coming to the Americas, some of them had actually already relocated to the Netherlands in search of freedom of worship. So according to some scholars, actually, they don't just come to New England only for religious freedom because they had already done that by going to the Netherlands, but also for commercial opportunities. Again, we were talking about the interplay between commerce and religion because they were just not prospering to the extent that they wanted to in the Netherlands textile industry. The Puritans, they thought that the separatists had gone too far. They also see the Church of England as insufficiently reformed, but they don't want to leave it. They want to purify it. So you mentioned Edmund Morgan earlier. He's got a great biography of John Winthrop also that really gets at these reasons. And so the group that's following John Winthrop to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, they come to believe that the best way to purify the Church of England is actually to create an ideal congregational church system across the Atlantic, that they'll have more ability to do that in Massachusetts. They also see commercial opportunity in the move, right? Just like the separatists. And they also have a sense of responsibility to evangelize the so-called heathens of the so-called New World. And the Massachusetts Bay Colony seal, I think, really illustrates this motive. It shows a Native American holding a downward pointing arrow that represents peace, and that has a speech bubble saying, "Come over and help us." Again, this comes out of the Black legend and the idea that the English are going to be better colonizers. They're going to create this ideal city on a hill for England to see, for the rest of the world to see. And at the same time, they're also going to be better at evangelizing indigenous people.
Now, if we move from the 1620s and 1630s, that founding era when the separatists established Plymouth Colony and the Puritans established Boston and the Massachusetts Bay Colony, If we move into the 1680s, we can start to see their descendants generating and publishing what would become called captivity narratives. This is a genre of accounts by colonists who had been captured by indigenous people and then spent time among those people. And one of the most famous captivity narratives was written by a woman named Mary Rowlandson in 1682. And today, when we read Rowlandson's experiences, we can clearly see how she linked religion with race and how this linkage allowed her and other English people to define indigenous peoples as heathens. So, Catherine, would you tell us about Mary Rowlandson, her story, and the connection she made between colonial English ideas of race and religion?
Mary Rowlandson's captivity narrative, which is called The Sovereignty and Goodness of God, it was published in the aftermath of King Philip's War. So Rowlandson was an English settler and a mother, and during the hostilities in the winter of 1676, she and 3 of her children were taken by a group of Nashaway-Nipmuc people, and they end up traveling with them for around 11 weeks. Rowlandson's description of her captivity, published 6 years later, became a colonial bestseller. So it went through multiple editions at a time when most families only owned the Bible and, maybe an almanac. But it wasn't the first of its kind. Captivity narratives were a genre that the English were familiar with. There were versions that were written by English people who'd been taken captive by the so-called Barbary pirates that followed similar patterns as Rowlandson's, describing the ordeal basically as a religious test and then describing their release as a sign of God's favor and goodness. And that's really how Rowlandson frames her account. She uses words to describe her captors that are basically religious epithets. She calls them bloody heathens, merciless heathens, and hellhounds. And her description is different from earlier English accounts of indigenous people that portray them as basically pitiable and needing to be freed from the devil's grip. She describes them as devils themselves. And she's fully identifying the English with God's chosen Israelites. She does ask why God had allowed the indigenous quote-unquote heathen to prevail for so long. What's the reason that God allows them to take Rowlandson and not just give the English the victory immediately? And she says that it's a test of the colonist faithfulness, just like was the case with Job in the Bible. And she said, now that we've survived the test, the Lord partnered with the colonists to, quote, destroy them. Again, just like he'd done with the Canaanites of biblical times. In terms of what this tells us about the relationship between religion and race, I think some scholars have seen this move from a kind of paternalistic pity for changeable heathens to the violent extermination of people who are marked as demonic others. They've seen that as marking the emergence of race. The idea here is that race requires a sense of intrinsic, ineradicable difference that cannot be converted away. So when the English move from trying to convert the heathen to trying to destroy them is when race comes into play, according to these scholars. And I argue something a bit different in the book, because I'm not so interested in marking a specific origin point for race, because I don't see race as only working through an idea of unchangeable difference. I argue that race can also work through the persistent and persisting idea that the other is changeable and needs to be changed, and that it's the responsibility of the European Christian colonizer to change them. In making this argument, I'm drawing from scholars like Geraldine Hung and Sylvester Johnson, who define race as a system of colonial governance that divides the colonizers from the colonized, the Europeans from non-Europeans. And it's clear to see that English colonizers in the aftermath of King Philip's War are turning from evangelizing to enslaving and exterminating. But later generations of Anglo-Americans return to evangelizing. And I think it's important to see both forms of othering coexisting and to see the violence in each, one aimed at the destruction of lives and the other at the destruction of cultures.
At this point, we've seen how religion was used to justify colonization, to justify the subjection of indigenous and African peoples into slavery, and to justify getting rid of them, to eradicate them, as the Rowlandson captivity narrative and other captivity narratives advocated for. So we've seen a lot of change over time. So let's take a break for a moment to thank our episode sponsor, and then we'll jump forward in time some more so that we can investigate how English ideas of race and religion had changed by the time of the American Revolution in the mid-18th century. On September 17, the United States celebrates Constitution Day. Constitution Day commemorates the signing of the United States Constitution on September 17, 1787, which is why on this day, the United States celebrates citizenship and what it means to be an American citizen. Here at the Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios, we're meeting with our colleagues from across the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation to prepare some great resources that'll help you celebrate and explore American citizenship. For example, our video team is preparing a short series of fun videos that explore the origin and evolution of American government and voting rights in the United States. The Bob and Marion Wilson Teacher Institute is going to host a teacher training about media literacy, as democracy in the United States has always relied on an informed citizenry. And here in Williamsburg, Virginia, Colonial Williamsburg is working on plans to host a naturalization ceremony so that we can welcome new American citizens to the United States. To learn more about the exciting resources we're preparing for Constitution Day, visit benfranklinsworld.com/civics. That's benfranklinsworld.com/civics. Catherine, let's leave the 17th century and jump right into the mid-18th century. How do you think English ideas, or I guess British ideas about race and religion had changed by the time we get to the American Revolution?
Between the publication of Rawlinson's text and the Revolution, there are some really important changes to note. I think most importantly, the influence of Enlightenment thinkers on European ideas about human difference. So, for instance, Carl Linnaeus and his student Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, who are trying to classify humans into types based on differences in physical appearance that they believe result from biology and climate. The Enlightenment obviously is not confined to just one century, but it's in the 18th century, according to a number of scholars, that an idea of race as observable and unchangeable physical difference solidifies, right? Because this is a period when thinkers are interested in classifying the world, not just human populations, but also animals, plants, et cetera, et cetera. And along with this interest in classifying the world, there's also a proliferation of publications that try to classify and typologize what are increasingly understood to be religions in the world. So instead of just understanding what people are practicing as kind of blanket heathenism, you now see the emergence of texts that try to explain what these various ceremonies and customs of the world are. And that's an abbreviated title of the Protestant Jean-Frédéric Bernard and Bernard Picquart's Compendium on the Religions of the World. Hannah Adams also publishes a number of texts on world religions, and these are often seen as kind of the origins of a framework of understanding world religions. So I think we might expect that the category of heathen loses some explanatory power as a result of these changes because it's getting broken up. Now different traditions are getting named. But my book also tries to be attuned to continuity as well as change. And I think that older understandings of human difference as religiously formed do not go away. So if converting so-called heathens is serving as an initial justification for colonization and enslavement, by the 19th century and into the 20th, converting the heathen world becomes a rallying cry for growing missions organizations.
That's right. And if we remember episode 47, we discussed with Emily Conroy Krutz her book, Christian Imperialism, where we can see this change in continuity that we're talking about now when it comes to evangelizing or not evangelizing people that some Christians viewed as heathens. And Emily also makes the point that when the United States achieved its independence, Americans kind of go through this period of trying to define who they were apart from Englishmen and Britons. And evangelizing was part of the way that they defined themselves as not Englishmen and not Britons. So, Catherine, I'm curious about your thoughts. In what ways do you think Christianity and religion helped or perhaps even hindered early Americans' quest to form a new American identity after the American Revolution?
There's some really excellent scholarship that I think actually gets more directly at this question than my book does. I'll just mention Kate Carte's award-winning Imperial History of Religion in the American Revolution. She shows how a kind of shared British imperial Protestant scaffold gave way as a result of the revolution and paved the way for new nationally bounded Protestant institutions, as she puts it. In terms of a new cultural identity, I think scholars have looked at what might be called civil religious elements that help to create a shared sense of Americanness over time. So this includes the Puritan idea of America as God's chosen nation, God's new Israel, destined to create a city on a hill for other nations. All of this language is language that we hear from politicians to this day. This myth was originally New England-based, but it did spread more widely, although some scholars have argued that it's not really until the Civil War that a fuller sense of American national identity rather than state-specific identity emerges. I think what my book tries to add to these broader conversations is how Americans are defining themselves against a heathen world out there, and how they define the heathen world as an outlet for their generosity and superiority. And this is not to say that the British did not similarly view the heathen world as a realm that required their help. American foreign missionary societies actually often piggyback on English societies at first. So, to a great extent, it's still a shared culture with regard to religion, race, and the heathen. I think the key difference is that the English don't have the same kind of chip on their shoulder that Anglo-Americans do in trying to prove that they are the colonizers and not the colonized, the givers and not the ones who are in need of help. And really, I think this chip on their shoulder dates back to the colonial era, when the brutality of wars with indigenous people and the brutalities of slavery led some back in Europe to question whether Anglo-Americans had themselves degenerated and backslid so that they were coming to seem more heathen than Christian. And I think this is really the backdrop to the publication of texts like Rowlandson's captivity narrative. As Jill Lepore puts it, in the name of war, writing about brutality in its aftermath, writing about war, is a way of winning it in memory, rewriting what actually happens to make one side look justified. So for Anglo-Americans, aligning themselves with Europeans and English colonizers against this heathen world is a way to convince themselves and others that they are fighting against the forces of wrong religion and not getting swept up by them.
That's an interesting framing and way to think about how early Americans tried to use religion and other ideas to make sure that the people around the world knew that they were the colonizers and not the people being colonized.
Right. We are on the right side of history, and we're going to write history to claim that.
And speaking of the writing of history, what do you think the legacies of using Christian religion and its ideas about heathens and other non-Christians accomplished for the Christian colonizers and the new United States?
Another way of putting that question might be, what has been the impact of this way of categorizing the other? In the book, I talk about these justifications as, I call it a get out of jail free card. Basically talking about how these religious rationalizations helped Anglo-Americans, European colonizers, to justify any manner of atrocities against people that they defined as heathens who needed to be changed. And again, this goes back to what I'm saying about understanding changeableness as an important part of racialization. The idea that people cannot stay as they are is a really powerful rationalization for the creation of boarding schools for indigenous children. It continues to be a rationalization for enslavement. If anything, in the 19th century, these pro-slavery apologists are drawing on the idea that enslavement is a way to Christianize people of African descent, perhaps more than they were even earlier on. It becomes a rationalization for continued encroachment and takeover of the lands of indigenous people. It becomes a reason to exclude Chinese people during the era of exclusion. So yeah, it's a powerful get out of jail free card. And you might ask, okay, well, is this all just like epiphenomenal rationalizations for what's really about money, what's really about land? And yeah, absolutely, these things are about money and land. But as I said earlier, I think they go hand in hand. I don't think just because something is fundamentally about money, that doesn't mean that ways in which they are rationalized become unimportant.
Well, just like your book, Heathen, we've had a wide-ranging conversation that has taken us from 1492 into the 19th century and beyond. So, Catherine, given this wide and sweeping view that you were able to take as you researched and wrote Heathen, is there one thing that you'd really like for us to better understand about the relationships between religion and race in early America?
I think the one thing that I would really like readers to understand, I've kind of been saying versions of already, but I'll try to say it maybe more succinctly. The search for the origins of race, which, if we're talking about early America in particular, there are a number of books that are about the emergence of race, the invention of race. I think that the search for the origins of race, for when changeable religious difference became intrinsic racial difference, can actually obscure the lasting importance of religion to processes of racialization. So race works in different ways in different contexts, and religious othering does not go away with the rise of biological racism. And I think what's most critical, again, to understand about religious othering is how the very changeability of the heathen other becomes the rationale for the takeover of their lands and the virtual eradication or attempt to eradicate their cultures. And this is racial governance. And I think that we need to be attuned to the continuing power of religion in justifying it.
Let's move into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently. Catherine, in your opinion, what might have happened if England had remained a Catholic country, or at least have been tolerant of Catholicism? What might the English and later American identities have looked like if they had had a long-standing Catholic heritage?
I think on the one hand, if we're thinking about this question primarily with regards to this history of heathen othering that we've been talking about, I think some things would have actually stayed the same because Catholics and Protestants shared some fundamental assumptions about heathens as wrongly religious and as requiring the intervention of European Christians to save. So the doctrine of discovery that I mentioned earlier, that animates both Catholic and Protestant nations. It's cited by the Supreme Court in an 1823 case as a reason for why the federal government has title to the lands of indigenous people. In terms of what would have been different, for one thing, the Black legend obviously would not have been an effective way of setting apart English from Spanish identity in the same way, right? The English would not have been able to use allegations of heathenness as a way of smearing Catholics themselves. I didn't really get into this earlier, but Protestants claimed that Roman Catholics were actually not sufficiently separated from the pagan past. Because they worship a pantheon of saints, they're basically practicing a form of polytheism instead of abiding by a strict monotheism. And Protestants claim that Catholic missionizers, because of this kind of polytheism, are also more open to the continuation of heathen superstitions, which allows indigenous people, according to Protestants, to fold their own customs and traditions into Catholic practices. And you see this kind of claim being made well into the 20th century, with Protestant missionaries basically saying that Catholics in parts of the Americas colonized by Spain are practicing a problematic Christopaganism that needs to be cleansed and purified. So if the English were Catholic, they obviously wouldn't have been able to make these kinds of claims against other Catholic societies, and they might have also created colonial societies that were more similar to the Spanish and French in terms of incorporating indigenous people into a caste-based system and incorporating some indigenous beliefs into Catholic practices. And I'm not saying that this kind of society is, quote unquote, better or worse than the British Protestant colonies. But if we think about this hypothetical and what might have developed, I think these are some of the similarities and differences we might see.
So, Catherine, what aspect of religion are you researching and writing about now?
My current work is focused on the late 19th century. So the first two books are pretty sweeping in scope. Definitely the second book is very sweeping in scope, and I'm trying to write a microhistory. I want to turn to narrative history of religious life under Chinese exclusion, using two Chinese immigrants as my main characters. One of them converted to Christianity, and the other converted but then unconverted and became a self-styled Confucian missionary to white America. So I'm interested in what their stories tell us about the religious options that were available to the Chinese in the late 19th century, and then also how Chinese immigrants used religion to fight back against exclusion and to offer different visions of what America might look like at a time of intense white Christian nationalism and xenophobia.
We've peppered you with a lot of questions, but we always have questions that pop up after we speak with someone. So where's the best place for us to get in contact with you?
The best place to find my contact information would be my bio on the Religious Studies Department webpage at Stanford. My email address is there, and I'd be happy to hear from you if you have lingering questions.
Well, Catherine Jin Lum, thank you for joining us and for helping us better understand heathens and the role that religion and ideas of heathenism played in conceptions of race and colonization.
Thank you so much again for having me, and thank you for these really great questions.
The early modern world was a place full of religion. Europeans and later Americans used different tenets and denominations of Christianity to justify their establishment of colonies and their treatment and enslavement of indigenous and African peoples. Our conversation with Catherine also revealed that nascent experiments with colonization actually started in Europe before Europeans ventured to the Americas. For example, in Spain, Spanish leaders and monarchs used Catholicism as a reason to fuel their expulsion and forced conversion of Jews and Muslims from Spain in a period called the Reconquista, which historians seem to date as taking place between 801 and 1492. We also know from other conversations on this podcast that the English practice aspects of their American colonialism in Ireland. And the same European countries who built empires in the Atlantic world did so after they had started work of forming empires in Asia. Now, as we discussed, economics and the power to bring in and create wealth for European nations served as a big reason that European countries built empires through colonization. However, as we discussed today, economics was not the only driving factor in colonization. Religion also drove Europeans and later Americans to seize lands from indigenous peoples and to act in harsh ways towards people who didn't look like them. The idea of the heathen was foundational to European Christian ideas about who they could subjugate, enslave, and dispossess from their land. As Catherine related, Europeans and later Americans understood heathens to be people who lived without Christianity and who appeared to live on land that they did nothing to improve, at least through European eyes. The idea of the heathen colored how Europeans and later Americans viewed non-Christians. According to their understandings, people they classified as heathens lacked morality and had ugly, sinful bodies simply because they weren't Christians. So Europeans and early Americans viewed indigenous and African peoples as peoples who needed to be changed. They needed to be converted to Christianity, even when there seemed to be an understanding that even if they did convert to Christianity, these peoples would have lacked enough purity of blood to ever be counted as full-fledged Christians, which led Europeans and early Americans to impose institutions of race-based slavery and other racial categories. Now, as Catherine noted, when we look at the process of race-making, the development of categories and groupings for human beings based on visual cues, such as skin color, facial features, or hair texture, or based on ancestry, we often look at the development of racial categories through the lens of economics, that labor was a driving force for creating different categories of people. But if we look closer at the origins of race, we can see that religious differences between people often played an intrinsic role in the development and sustaining of different race-based categories and groupings. So religion is part of the answer for the question of what history can tell us about how we as Americans came to define people by their race. Look for more information about Catherine, her book, Heathen, plus notes, links, and a transcript for everything we talked about today, all in the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/392. We have a lot of exciting episodes coming up, and as friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts, please be a good friend and tell your friends about Ben Franklin's World. Production assistance for this podcast comes from my colleagues at Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios: Jordan Hammond, Ashley Bachnight, Derek Glickback, and Morgan McCullough. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, the topics of religion and the origins of racial difference in the United States are really big topics. So what more would you like to know about them? There are so many different perspectives that we could take, so let me know what perspectives interest you most. Liz at benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios.